Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and welcome to the next session of the Hannah Arendt Virtual Reading Group. This week, we're going to be talking about Hannah Arendt's essay, Tradition and the Modern Age. It's the first essay in her book, Between Past and Future, after the prologue, which we discussed last week. Let me just emphasize what I take to be the three-part movement of this essay that I hope will simplify it. And it wasn't in the video introduction, so this will be new. The start of the essay is that there is a tradition. The tradition in the West more or less has its beginnings with Plato and Aristotle, and specifically with the periagoge, the turning of the soul that Plato describes in his analogy of the cave in Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And the core of that idea in the cave is that the way we typically see the world with our eyes, our physical eyes, and our senses is a world of shadows, a world of darkness, and it's not true. And that the truth is up there. It's a supersensuous, ideal truth of eternal verities, and Plato calls these the ideas. These ideas are true eternally, and everything that's in the world is always a mere copy of and one that will decay and therefore not true. Aristotle, Plato's student, adds to this description and says that therefore man is an animal rationale. Well, that's the Latin translation. In the Greek, he says that man is a zoon logon echon, which means he's an animal, a zoon, from our word zoo, from the zoon, an animal that has logos or logon, which is a difficult word that can mean both speech and reason, but it's what gathers the world together. Its actual root in Greek is from furrowing and farming. It's the gathering and tilling of the soil to form something in common. And so that's the tradition, that man is this rational animal who's distinguished from other animals and all other living beings by the primary quality that he has logos, that he thinks. That's the tradition that she says is coming to an end or has come to an end. And there's two different ways that it comes to an end. The first way is conceptually, philosophically. And so if the tradition has its philosophical beginning with Plato and Aristotle, it has its philosophical or conceptual end in Marx. She thinks Marx is the key, but she actually names three thinkers that bring it to its conceptual end: Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. And she, at all parts in the essay, discusses all three of them. The basic argument here is that if the Platonic inversion or turn was the turn away from this world to a world of true ideas, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche are a second turn away from the true world of ideas back to this world. So for Kierkegaard, we turn away from the truth of God to man's concrete suffering and his faith, but one that is always doubtful. And for Nietzsche, we turn away from man as a rational animal to man as a willing animal seeking power, a will to power. And for Marx, we turn away from animal rationale to what Marx calls the animal laborans, the laboring animal, an animal who is socialized and lives in society. And there are no true values, what there are social values. And so in this turn, the second turn, a number of things happen. The idea of truth as eternal, the Platonic idea, is undone. We no longer have eternal truths because truths are not up there, they're in the world. The trust in things as they appear is undone. We no longer can take for granted that when you stick a stick in the river, it's bent, it looks bent. We understand that the way things appear is always not what they really are. Being is beyond appearance. We no longer have trust in revealed truth from God. Even the Kantian idea and the Enlightenment idea that truth is a product of reason, that man's reason can yield universal truths, is undone. And the result of this, as Arendt says, is that truth becomes a working hypothesis. Or in other words, truth becomes a mere value. It's something that's not true. It's something we decide upon socially, democratically, through our own socialized values. We decide what our ends are. And the result is that truth is no longer true. It's valuable. And so this is the undoing of truth that Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche all recognize is happening and articulate in their own ways. And this is the end of tradition conceptually. And yet, Arendt says, even when tradition ends conceptually, most of us don't understand or read Nietzsche, Marx, and Kierkegaard. And so the value, the idea of man as a rational animal, the value of truth continues to exist. And even though it doesn't have real power in our society, we actually submit to it because we're scared of losing it. We're so scared that the value would disappear and we don't have truth. We hold on to it, and the value can actually become even more powerful, but in a tyrannical way, because we know it's not true, and yet we obey it anyway. And it becomes not something that we are persuaded by, but something that we live according to. The third step, which is not talked about so much in this essay, but is simply highlighted and mentioned, is that the conceptual end of the tradition of animal rationale, that ends with Marx, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard, has a factual end, not in a theoretical event, but in a deed, in a factual event, namely totalitarian domination that emerged in Germany during the National Socialist period and in the Soviet Union during the Stalinist era. Here was a situation in which we didn't simply conceptually understand that man is not a rational animal, or in another formulation, man is an end in himself, therefore can never be used as a means. We lived it. Man, under the totalitarian domination, becomes something that can be destroyed, something that can be killed simply to serve ends. Yeah, we always had wars and we'd always killed people, but it was not, Arendt is arguing, because we simply saw man as disposable. Man is now only useful insofar as he serves ends, and to the extent men don't serve ends, are superfluous, or killing them will lead to other ends, we have no qualms about killing them. So we move from the idea of nihilism in Nietzsche and Marx and Kierkegaard, that anything is permissible. We can sort of have any values. There are no highest values. That's nihilism, right? The devaluing of all highest values so that all values are equal. To what she considers to be the motto of totalitarian domination, which is not that anything is permissible, but anything is possible. Not only is it permissible, it can happen. And we have simply no ability or need to stop it from happening, because we don't actually believe that human life is valuable. I mean, is more than value. I mean, has dignity outside of its exchange or use value. So I'm sorry, I wanted to go over the structure because it is a complicated essay. I thought I'd sort of lay out that structure. And so the claim here is that tradition has ended conceptually with the rise of the modern age in the 18th and 19th centuries, and to a large extent, it's even ended factually with the rise of totalitarian domination. And we now find ourselves in this gap between past and future, where we have to think for ourselves. For the first time, she argues, since Plato and Aristotle, since the Greeks, and that is an enormous uh, um, shift in in the human activity. So that's the challenge we face, and these essays that we're going to read are what she calls exercises in such thinking. As we discussed at the end of last week's session, the prologue ends with her saying that this book of essays, the book Between Past and Future, is a collection of exercises in thinking, and she says they're going to be given in a sequence, and the sequences are divided into 3 parts. And the first part deals with the modern break in tradition and with the concept of history with which the modern age hoped to replace the concepts of traditional metaphysics. These are the most philosophical and complicated of the essays in the book, or philosophically complicated. But we need to, in this first essay, try and understand by what she means by tradition and the modern age. On one level, tradition is the easier word. We use it in everyday parlance. Through etymology and grammar, it means to carry over, traditio in Latin, that which is carried over or up from the past. And so the traditions that we have are those what's carried over and left and we today have from deep in our past. Modern age is the more difficult word or phrase, and we have to understand that she distinguishes modern age from the modern world. She does this both in this essay and in her book, The Human Condition. The modern world is the 20th century, which is defined by, she says, the fact of the break of tradition. And the actual moment, if there is one, of the break of tradition is the rise of totalitarianism and totalitarian forms of government. For her, she says on page 26, totalitarian domination as an established fact has broken the continuity of Occidental history. And so the modern world is the world in which this continuity of Occidental history has been broken. The modern age is something very different. And the modern age, she says, is the age of science. And it begins in the 17th century, and it pretty much continues through till somewhere around the 20th century. So she'll say again on page 26, the event or the fact of totalitarian domination as the break in our tradition itself marks the division between the modern age, which now she describes as rising with the natural sciences in the 17th century, reaching its political climax in the revolutions of the 18th, and unfolding its general implications after the Industrial Revolution of the 19th. So on the one hand, we have the modern age in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and the modern world, which she then characterizes as the world of the 20th century, which came into existence through the chain of catastrophes touched off by the First World War, leading to the Second World War and totalitarianism. In The Human Condition, she makes this distinction again, and talks about how the modern age is not the same as the modern world on page 6 in the preface to The Human Condition, and again identifies the modern age as scientific, as the age of science, and the modern world, she says, was born with the first atomic explosion. So it's a slightly different characterization of the modern world. The break of tradition in one is the rise of totalitarian government, and in the other is the atomic explosion. They're actually two sides of a similar coin. The modern world can be said to start politically with the rise of totalitarianism, because it's the break of tradition. All prior governments are different in a substantial and meaningful way than totalitarianism, which is a totalizing domination, which had never been tried or sought before. And that has a scientific ground to it, which is that you can only seek a totalizing government, one that seeks total domination, in an age of science, in which you think that there are scientifically knowledgeable and scientifically derivable truths that can explain all world history and all politics, like, for example, the Jews are corrupting the world, that can underlie a totalitarian politics. Or, for example, that the proletariat will rise and take over the bourgeoisie. These are scientific principles that can underlie a scientific totalitarian government. Similarly, the atom bomb is not the political beginning of the modern world, but the scientific beginning of the modern world, insofar as it is it stands for Arendt for the moment at which human action and human intervention has become so powerful that it threatens to destroy the entire world. And these two events, totalitarianism in politics and the atom bomb in science, are for her the events that signal the break of the end of our tradition and open up really something utterly new in the world. Her book, The Human Condition, is actually not about the world post the atom bomb. It's about attempting to understand the modern age and the leading up to the break in tradition in science, which she argues leads to and underlies what she calls world alienation. The alienation from the world and from the earth. That is really the subject of the human condition. Similarly, in this essay, Tradition in the Modern Age, she's focused primarily not on the 20th century and the modern world, but on the 18th and 19th centuries, and specifically three thinkers, Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche, who stand at the very end of the tradition, just before the break came. So just before, in this case, the rise of totalitarian governance. Why is she interested in these three thinkers and then sort of the prehistory and not the break? In many ways, because we don't yet know what to make of the break. This is an exercise in thinking. It's an exercise in the prehistory of the situation we find ourselves in now, which is the break in tradition. She wants to emphasize that these three thinkers, Marx, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, are not responsible for the break in tradition. They're not responsible for totalitarianism. They didn't cause it to happen. It was going to happen anyway. But they are great thinkers, and their greatness, she says, and this is on page 27, she says their greatness lay in the fact that they perceived their world as one invaded by new problems and perplexities which our tradition of thought was unable to cope with. They saw problems, perplexities that the tradition couldn't answer. What is the tradition? I mean, just to be clear, so we're all on the same page, the tradition of political thinking, at least, begins with a turn, a periagoge, a turn of the soul away from this world to the world of truth and the world of ideas. This was in Plato's thinking. And in Plato, the truth is eternal in the ideas. In Christianity, truth is in the city of God. For the rationalists, truth was in reason. And for all of these thinkers, truth stands outside of the messy world as sort of a eternal beacon, which we can know through a study of metaphysics. That is, which is beyond the physical world. Meta, beyond; physics, physical. And so, from Plato really up through Bentham and Mill and the rationalists, Leibniz, Bentham, and Mill, Arendt sees the tradition as being one in which there are non-physical, supraphysical, suprasensuous truths. But starting around the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, starting with science does something corrosive to the tradition, which is it infuses doubt into the tradition. So on page 39, if we're going to skip a little bit ahead just to sort of see where she's headed, she says on page 39, since the rise of modern science, whose spirit is expressed in the Cartesian philosophy of doubt and mistrust, the conceptual framework of the tradition has not been secure. So science unsettles the idea of truths. Now, that's funny because we think of science as about truth and about finding truth beyond what we see, and that's true. But every truth that exists is doubted by science, right? That's the scientific method, and mistrusted by it, and we look to find firm foundations for it. And inevitably, we find that the foundations we think exist are not as firm as we thought. And this is the will to truth that Nietzsche describes, that in the end kills truth, and also God, and in the end also reason, as metaphysical first principles that can found strong, stable truths and worlds. And so this concept of truth as revelation, as reason, as science undoes itself. And this leads to a real sense of uncertainty. And it's these new problems and perplexities that our tradition of thought was unable to deal with. And these thinkers were more honest than other thinkers, Nietzsche, Marx, and Kierkegaard. They really saw that science challenged the entire foundation of what the Western tradition in a way that their contemporaries did not. And they were frightened by this, what she calls on page 27, the dark and silent way in which the tradition now appeared to them as insecure, dark, and unsustainable. And in what is in many ways the most beautiful and famous line of this essay, on page 27 at the bottom of the continued paragraph, she says, "But the thunder of the eventual explosion has also drowned the preceding ominous silence that still answers us whenever we dare to ask not, what are we fighting against, but what are we fighting for?" The claim here is that for Nietzsche, Marx, and Kierkegaard, they were fighting against things. They were fighting against metaphysics, fighting against tradition, trying to free themselves from these truths of tradition, which they now saw as unsustainable. But today, when we are freed from tradition, when we really live without tradition in Arendt's reading, the silence that we hear is not the silence of tradition, but the silence of what we could argue for. We're not fighting against tradition anymore. That fight's been won. Our problem is actually deciding what, if anything, we believe in, absent a tradition. And that's really, in many ways, the question that this essay is struggling with. Is there a way, in the absence of the tradition, to fight for something, to believe in anything that's not just a subjective or personal belief, but is true in a public way? Another of the sort of, I think, beautiful and favorite formulations in this text is right at the beginning on page 18, where she talks about a remark that Plato makes in his book, The Laws, the dialogue, The Laws, where he says, the beginning is like a god, which as long as it dwells among men, saves all things. The point is that as long as you have a beginning, as long as you have a rich beginning, you can think of it, if it helps in the American context, of the founding fathers, the Constitution. As long as that beginning is alive, we can, every new problem that emerges, right, we can make sense of. We can rejigger the Constitution to allow for civil rights, women's suffrage, immigration, transgender rights. We can take the beginning, and as long as it's alive and as long as it's working, it's like a god. It allows us to save all things because we can take the principle and make it work. But once that tradition dies, once we say, like some people say today, the Constitution is not written for me, the Constitution was an old thing, it's dead, it's as we now say, it's part of an American creed written for white men and not for us, and therefore we don't need to pay attention to it in this living way. If we make that move, it no longer has that power, and in a sense, then it becomes destructive, she says. The tradition becomes destructive. And she says this on page 18 as well, right after that. By the same token, the tradition became destructive as it came to its end, to say nothing of the aftermath of confusion and helplessness, which came after the tradition ended and in which we live today. And so that's the danger, that if the tradition ends, we risk real danger and confusion. And yet, she's arguing it has ended. Not maybe the American constitutional tradition, although I think that's arguable, but she's arguing that the Western metaphysical, philosophical, and political traditions and scientific traditions have ended. And on page 28, she says that this can also be a very good thing, not just a bad thing. And so it's worth reading this passage on page 28. She writes on 28, Kierkegaard, Marx, and Nietzsche are for us like guideposts to a past which has lost its authority. So they're still fighting against tradition. And insofar as they're fighting against tradition, the tradition is visible in them. In Nietzsche, the tradition is God and science. In Marx, the tradition is sort of bourgeois power, the state, and also man is a rational animal, whereas for Marx, man is an active being, and not necessarily rational, but a laboring being in Arendt's reading. And so, but in their fighting against the tradition still is alive, but we can see it in its loss for us. These three thinkers were the first who dared to think without the guidance of any authority whatsoever. They sought to free themselves from the tradition and think without that. Yet, for better or worse, they were still held by the categorical framework of the great tradition. So she thinks that these three thinkers are still in the tradition, and yet they're fighting against it. And she says we no longer need to be concerned with the scorn for the educated Philistines, who all through the 19th century tried to make up for the loss of authentic authority with a spurious glorification of culture. To most people today, this culture looks like a field of ruins, which, far from being able to claim any authority, can hardly command their interest. In a sense, our culture, that which has been cultivated as our tradition for thousands of years, not only has no authority, in general, we're not interested in it. This fact, she says, may be deplorable, but implicit in it is a great chance to look upon the past with eyes undistracted by any tradition, with a directness which has disappeared from Occidental reading and hearing ever since Roman civilization submitted to the authority of Greek thought. And here's the optimistic angle that Arendt takes. And in all of her work, there's an optimistic angle. Sometimes people forget that because she seems so pessimistic. But in the loss of authority and the loss of tradition, we have the potential to revisit the past and look at it with eyes undistracted by the tradition. And that allows us to potentially start a new tradition, start a new world, to live in a world without the banisters, without the guideposts that the tradition provided, to live freely in a way that we haven't lived, she's arguing, since the Roman Empire. But that's dangerous, but also there's a kind of great opportunity in it. And that's the gap between past and future, where we think without banisters that we talked about in the preface last month. And that's what all these essays in the book are now about to do. She's trying to say that in this book, we're going to read essays and think through problems free from the tradition. But that doesn't mean we just think la-di-da, anything we want, right? The reason we read Nietzsche and Marx and Kierkegaard is because in their fight against the tradition, which was the most articulate and insightful fight against the tradition that we've seen, they bring the beginning, the principle, to light. What is the principle? Well, it's what they're all fighting against. It's the principle of man as a rational animal, man as, in some sense, unique in the world, as a spirited, rational, thinking, God-given, godly created, semi-divine being. That's the truth. That's the idea in the Platonic sense, in the Christian sense. The faith in religion that Kierkegaard is rebelling against, the idea of a rational man that Marx is rebelling against, the idea of a true, rational, God-created individual with morality that Nietzsche is fighting against. And they not only show their disagreements with the tradition, they show the essence of the tradition. And that's what Arendt finds to be so important in their work. And so we, as the benefits of their critiques, are at the point where we can understand both the tradition, which they rebelled against, that failed, and which we can't just go back to and re-enliven or reimagine, the tradition of either a God-given or a rationalist truth, a metaphysical tradition. But we also see their rebellion against it, which has its height in Marx's elevation of labor over reason, and Nietzsche's elevation of values over truths, or lies over truths. And we see the limits of both sides. And we are now in the position of the fighter in the gap between past and future, who have to use what we know and the tradition that we have, broken as it is, as a way to try and make our way in the world. And so I'll just read the last paragraph of the essay, and we'll end with that. These values in their X and interchangeability, and let me just stop for a second and say, the values are the social values that Nietzsche says replace all truths. We no longer have truths. We have things we value more than others. This is Arendt talks about this through Nietzsche on pages 32 to 33, where she says the term value owes its origin to the sociological trend, and that it's associated with exchange value in Marx, with the birth of the social sciences, when and it can be located, she says, at the moment when all things, ideas as well as material objects, were equated with values, so that everything derived its existence from and was related to society. We now put a value on everything. There are no highest values. God is a value. We can believe in it or not, depending on whether it's useful or not. Truth, rational truth, is something we can evaluate. And we set ourselves in the position of evaluating. This is what Nietzsche calls nihilism, the devaluing of the highest values, the Umwertung aller Werte, in which there are no highest values. They're all devalued and thus valued in the sense that we value them. And so back to page 39, these values in their excellent interchangeability are the only ideas left to and understood by socialized men. All we have are values. We have no truths. These are men who have decided never to leave what to Plato was the cave of everyday human affairs, and never to venture on their own into a world and a life which, perhaps, the ubiquitous functionalization of modern society has deprived of one of its most elementary characteristics, the instilling of wonder at that which is as it is. In other words, the values, the devaluing of the highest values, the making of the world about values, means that we are socialized men, and all we have are the values we make and create, that we give value to. And thus, what do we lose? We lose wonder at that which is. We lose truths. And anytime people talk about nostalgia for anything great, for a time past, we immediately say that nostalgia is false. It's partial. When you built those great pyramids, there were slaves who built them. When you created the United States Constitution, there were slaves here. All true. When you built the U.S. highway system, it was for war, not for peace and interchange and commerce. True. And so we devalue. We don't let anything be valued highly or highest. And there are no. We say courage is a value, but we also say meekness is a value. We say brilliance and being brilliant is a value, but we also know that brilliant people get caught up in their own worlds, and being sort of middling can be a value. And so we learn to value everything, which is the modern way. It's a rationalizing world, which means we make rationalizations, and there are no highest values. And the result of that is the loss of wonder. And as she says, continuing, when we do this, we don't actually get rid of the ideas, the highest values, but we do record the darkening of the clear sky where those ideas, those truths, as well as many other presences, had once become visible to the eyes of men. That's how she ends the essay. And so that's the loss that the break in tradition leaves us with. The loss of the clear sky of the ideas of truths. And the gain is that we now are free to battle, to sort of look again at the principles and the critiques and see if we can make a world on our own, which is the only option we have left. And that's how Arendt leaves it. And we will continue on with the rest of the book. But first, I look forward to talking to you about this essay. Thank you very much.